Hi, and welcome to another episode of About the Authors TV. I'm your host, Jake Brown. Dizzying plot twists and multiple surprise endings, our best-selling mystery author Megan Miranda is stock in trade in the esteemed opinion of the New York Times, writing a signature brand of suspenseful thrillers for 2 decades now that began with her Fracture duology, consisting of Fracture, 11 Minutes, and Vengeance, and other early hits like Hysteria and Soul Print, The Safest Lines, and All the Missing Girls, a breakout bestseller that the New York Times Book Review declared will probably be called Hitchcockian, and the Wall Street Journal named as one of its 5 killer books of 2016. The Reese Witherspoon Book Club pick creator of The Last Houseguest, and other hits like The Perfect Stranger, Fragments of the Lost, Come Find Me, The Girl from Widow Hills, Such a Quiet Place, and Last to Vanish most recently, which Publishers Weekly crowned a superb thriller. She takes out time today to talk about her fascinating creative process. Megan, thank you so much for being here. How early were you pulling books down off your parents' shelves, and would it be safe to assume that some of them were mysteries?
Yeah, I was, I'm a huge lifelong reader. My mom was a huge reader. My grandma's a huge reader. I come from a family of big readers, and my mom was a big mystery and thriller reader as well. And so that really is like the books that were on our shelves at home. And every week growing up, she would bring me to the library. We went every Thursday, and she would just let me really roam the aisles. And I remember just coming out with these stacks of books every week. And I read very broadly. I love stories and storytelling of all kinds. But I found that even from a young age, like mysteries really were the thing that spoke to me. I was just fascinated by the puzzles inside and the puzzles inside other people. So, Nancy Drew was one of like the first series that, I was just so invested in growing up. And from there, I think I kind of transitioned to, I was a big Michael Crichton fan. I'm somebody who loved reading and writing, and I also loved science, and his books really kind of spoke to both that mystery thriller aspect and science as well. But I grew up with books, and I feel so fortunate to have grown up that way.
Teachers play such a consequential role in expanding a young reader's mind. Any new authors you were introduced to in that tradition?
It's funny that you mentioned that because I did have an experience where I feel like the wonderful thing about teachers is they know, like, they can find that right perfect book for the right reader. And I had a teacher who introduced me to Michael Crichton because they just knew the types of interests that I had, but also that I loved to write. I loved creative writing. And I remember that moment of someone putting Jurassic Park in my hands, and it sort of just blew my mind open of the different possibilities, like you were talking about, of the different ways that genre blending can occur. And that sort of really sparked something new in me, I think. But I didn't really pursue writing as a career right away, right out of school, but it was just always my lifelong passion. And it's always the thing I said I wanted to do. I just didn't really take the steps to doing it until I was a little bit out of school.
Piecing together the puzzle of a mystery like you do has to draw on your mathematical mind. And for viewers who don't know about your impressive educational track, you study biology microtechnology at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, famously known around the world as MIT. How do you feel like that education ironically wound up preparing you to write books down the road?
I think, looking back in hindsight, I definitely can kind of see this path. I majored in biology, and I know it feels like they're very different paths, but I feel like at the heart, they're both kind of like mysteries and asking questions. And so I was somebody who was always kind of inspired by the questions that people would ask that we didn't have the answers to just yet. And I did find myself when I started writing my first books, they were young adult suspense, but they had this kind of what if science question at the heart of it. And so I feel like it was kind of all those experiences that I guess kind of sparked the ideas that I was thinking about. And I feel like questions are what kind of fuel a story when you're writing it. And in addition to that, I do think that the process of science isn't that different from the process of writing a book, and how, your first draft, at least my first drafts, I don't always get them right. They're not told the right way. And you kind of take a step back and you think, okay, what happens if I change this? And so I guess I see it in a way of an experiment. Like, I'm not afraid to try a different structure or start over, and every step is not like a failed draft, but something that gets you closer and closer to the version of how you want to tell it or the right way to tell it.
Your alma mater's newspaper indeed once reported that Miranda credits the thematic elements of her young adult books in part to her coursework at MIT, where she mixed bioengineering with a steady dose of anthropology and literature. And that spirit, when did all those bits of the formula first combine creatively to inspire the Fracture series, which kicks off with your debut novel of the same title, the novella 11 Minutes and the sequel Vengeance?
When I was younger, I actually, it was the first idea I had when I sat down and thought about writing a full story, a full book, a book length story. And it did take me several versions to get it right. But it came to me. So I worked in biotech after I graduated, and then I was a high school science teacher. And it was kind of during this time, and I started reading YA, young adult literature voraciously as well. I read both adult and young adult. And so I think they were inspired by, the fact that I had been teaching and had my science background, and my first book kind of combined all of my different experiences.
Your creative mind next blasted off into the realm of Alina Chase story and Soulprint. This feels again like an idea you could have just been sitting in class back in college, and just from the naturally fascinating material that you were taking in each day. Could that one have maybe caught your ear to say that's a good idea for a book?
This one was something that was inspired by kind of a question I had in biology class. Growing up when I was much younger. And, I was fascinated by genetics and, kind of everything that happened, all the discoveries that were made in that time. And I just had this like, what if moment. And I remember being like, what if, scientists discovered the soul and what would that look like? And what if, and this kind of spurred the idea for Soulprint, what if they discovered that it could be tracked life to life to life? And then it, became this science fiction idea, but it was like one of those things that came to me when I was much younger, just this question that came from biology. But I love X-Files. So, I'm really drawn to those stories of the unexplained and what's possible.
Our compliments to whomever the illustrator was at the publishing house that created that super cool cover. It looked just like a movie poster. That's so important too to an author on the rise because, as we often joke about on the show, in spite of the cautionary adage, don't judge a book by its cover, so many readers do when they're walking the aisles preparing to maybe take a chance on a new author.
I'm not somebody who's very visual. And so, when I'm asked for ideas, mine are very like plot, like maybe it's somebody doing this and they're running and they were like, here's a thumbprint with her face in it. And I was like, oh, wow, it's incredible. I never would have come up with that idea. And I thought it was just brilliant how it kind of captures that idea right from the get-go.
The school library journal would similarly spotlight this unique stylistic gift of yours for weaving your scientific expertise into your mystery writing, once again with The Safest Lies, where they highlighted an insightful bit of research on mice epigenetics, referenced by her mother's therapist, that reveals that parents' fears can actually be passed on second-generation children through DNA, even though they've not experienced the same traumas. As part of their praise for your delivering YA suspense at its very best, this psychological thriller will blow readers' minds. Please take viewers and fans back into the story that sweeps up poor old Kelsey when her mother goes missing after 17 years of not leaving her house.
So The Safest Lies is, I'd pitched it originally as like the science of fear meets the movie Panic Room. And, I love the movie Panic Room. And I think there's something fascinating about, that idea of what can you do with like a home invasion type story and all the different layers. And this was one that was a little bit inspired by science as well. And it was this idea of whether fears could be inherited. And so that was what really kicked off this idea. And it's a teenage girl who her mother hasn't left the house in 17 years since she's been born. And she's been raised in this environment of fear. And there's this question of, is it nature? Is it nurture? But they've set up this house very much like a fortress with all these levels and layers of defense. Of course, the one day Kelsey sneaks out and starts, acting a little bit more like a teenager. She comes home and her mother is missing. And so suddenly, she knows her mother wouldn't have left on her own. And it becomes this question of like, what really happened to my mother? And, are these fears, is everything that she's afraid of, is it really coming to me now?
Long before the Los Angeles Review of Books first predicted that All the Missing Girls is set to become one of the best books of 2016, when you were first sitting down to plot this masterpiece, one that Elle magazine promised will test your brain with its reverse chronological structure, and it's a page turner to boot. What initially gave you the idea to tell a story backwards from day 15 to 1?
All the Missing Girls, I knew from the very start was going to be told in reverse. It was kind of the initial spark of the idea. I'm fascinated with characters, and I was fascinated with this idea of telling a story in reverse so that as you're moving back in time, you're kind of stripping away another layer of why something happened. And so you're kind of solving like the what along with the why in a different way. And I wrote it in the order that it's read. So it was a lot of trial and error and a lot of, I would realize something, I'd learned something later and then realize everything I wrote would have to change because, chronologically that was things that happened later. But that was kind of the very core of the idea was, the story that you had to, the main character realizes she has to go back in time to figure out what happens. And so thematically, it felt like it was tying everything together.
The New York Times has just been a big fan of yours from day one, spotlighting your next bestseller, The Perfect Stranger, as an eerie suspense thriller that's set against a classic backdrop for a mystery novel. A house in rural Pennsylvania, and with two characters who hardly know each other living together. In this case, journalists Leah Stevens and Emmy Gray, weaving together a story that follows, where the Times noted you smartly examine the theme of personality identity.
I love setting books in small towns in general. I feel like I live in a small town, so I love small towns. And I like to make up all my towns because of that, because I feel like I'm taking someone's lovely town and then, turning them very creepy. So funny story here is I didn't realize this when I was writing the book, but I got about 60 pages in and realized that I had basically created this setting that I was familiar with from my childhood. My grandparents had this cabin in the Poconos, and my cousins and I all used to go there in the summer, and we would pile into this house. And, there was no phone, there was no television, and it was very much isolated, and we would love it. We'd have the best time. And then at night, everything that we loved about that isolation would suddenly turn like very creepy. And so that was sort of the inspiration for this setting was that, she moves to this place. It's very idealized in her mind. It's a fresh start. And then when something goes terribly wrong, how do all of those things that she loved, kind of what's the other side of that? And how can all those things kind of turn against her instead?
As an example of how you write, are you more of a character sketcher before you begin working on a new book like this one, or do you alternately like to have the plot more or less outlined before you sit down to start writing?
I start with character before plot generally, or they kind of come hand in hand where it feels like the character is kind of suited for, this idea. But I really am someone who has to write my way into stories to figure out not only the plot, but who the character is. I feel like I just give myself the freedom to start and get to know what their relationships are like, get to know what they're afraid of, and discovering all those kind of nuances within a relationship and how their past has kind of influenced the people they become and how they react to things is part of the joy of writing a story and discovering who they are. And so I think of my early drafts, and especially the first half of that, as sort of a discovery process. And so I do have to factor in a lot of time for revision because of that, because I don't do a lot of outlining up front or big character planning.
Do you think if you did outlines, they get in the way of your creative process?
Yeah, I think for me, it's just realizing what process works for me. I'm also not someone who can see a whole story up front. I'm very jealous of outliners because I feel like once they start, they know like this is the story and this is in general probably how long it's going to take for me to write this book or to work on this story. And I also find there's joy for me in that process. Like as a mystery reader, like the puzzle is kind of the fun part. And for me as the writer, that's the fun of writing it as well. And so I think of the first half of the book as like discovering puzzle pieces and then trying to, solve it in the latter half of the book. I've tried, sometimes I can see, the backstory. I might know what happened in the past, and that I know from the start, but it's very rare that I know what happens in the present. I might know one of the threads, and that helps create like a backbone. And that's always very helpful to have. But I can say I've never had the full story from the get-go, but I wish.
Talk about puzzles. With the Fragments of the Lost, this book is fascinating in the way you assembled it and wove all the pieces of the mystery together for readers. Please unravel a bit of the complexities of writing a book like this one for viewers and fans.
I definitely do have tools that I use. So for Fragments of the Lost, which is a mystery in pieces, and it's told basically in found objects. And so it's not linear, but the story that is, being created is giving you the full picture. And I have like Excel spreadsheets for every one of my books. And, I have like scene by scene, not only kind of what happens, but kind of clues that I'm leaving along the way and reveals. And so I can kind of track those and make sure that, they're creating, a story that flows, and I'm not leaving anything hanging. So I do rely heavily on Excel spreadsheets as I'm writing. I feel like I create a very detailed outline as I go. I just don't do it beforehand. And then I'm moving things around afterwards.
You invited us on a different sort of ride in Come Find Me, where Kennedy Jones and Nolan Chandler are connected by a radio telescope signal pattern. What a brilliantly unique premise for a book. Would you give fans a little peek at the inspiration behind this recent bestseller?
I have some ideas that sit with me for a long time. And suddenly there's a moment where I'm like, okay, now I see how it's coming together. And this is the moment to write this story. And Come Find Me was one of them. All the Missing Girls was another one. And I think because they have those questions in them, like, how am I going to make this work? And so they're not quite ready to be written yet, but they're like sitting in the back of my mind for a long time. I was a big X-Files fan, love that show. And, I think I'd had this idea, and then I was also watching Stranger Things. And I suddenly realized like that was kind of the combination of the pitch. It's kind of X-Files meets Stranger Things, and also like a YA Contact. And so, Contact was one of my favorite movies when I was younger too. And the signal, no one really knows what it's meaning. And so those kind of questions inspire me, I think. But this was one of those ideas that had to sit for a while before I figured out the right way to tell it and how I was going to make these two stories overlap and what I was trying to say.
Out of curiosity, what is a bit of the difference for you between writing characters in the YA and then the adult mystery realm?
I think the thing I love about writing YA and reading YA is it's a lot of times characters are figuring out things for the first time. I think one of the hallmarks of YA is experiencing things for the first time and maybe figuring out who you are and putting events into context. And not that in my adult books, characters are not figuring out who they are, but I think in YA, there's this immediacy. And that's how I approach them differently is like the adult books. I feel like there's this element of hindsight and everything that's happened in your past influences, who they become, and you're filtering everything through these experiences. And in YA, there's sort of this complete immediacy. And maybe because of that, everything is a little bit heightened emotionally as well. And so I had these two characters who had really suffered these terrible losses and felt very alone, and their stories they narrate separately, and they're both searching for something. They've been they believe they found the signal, and they're searching for meaning behind it, and you can kind of see the shadow of one another in each other's stories as well. Like they're kind of not noticing each other, and so to me it kind of became a story about connection, and two characters finding one another throughout this as well.
Frequent fan of the New York Times paid you the highest compliment yet in their review of The Last House Guest when they quipped that if you want to sample the black humor of summer resort relationships, have breakfast at the local diner of a pretty coastal town like Littleport, Maine, and a plot that follows focusing on a suspicious murder set against the classic divisions of a vacation town like this one. I've spoken to a lot of your peers in the genre who've used this trope as successfully in their own story. Why was this one an appealing backdrop for you to set the book against?
This was one I definitely started with place, and I was fascinated with this idea of vacation towns and how different they are in the summer versus in the winter. And thinking about like the people who come every year in the summer and maybe have their second homes there. And then the people whose livelihoods in a way depend on these visitors coming, and also kind of have their own view of this town. And so I was fascinated by how a town could have two completely different perspectives, somebody who is an insider and somebody who is an outsider and maybe only sees the place for 3 months a year. And then I kind of thought about this really intense friendship that crossed the divide. So it was really this relationship between Avery and Sadie, who's from one of the wealthiest towns, one of the wealthiest families in the town. And from there is where kind of the mystery came. But it really, I feel like Avery and Sadie kind of grew from the dynamic of this town. The story itself kind of explores these different power dynamics. And I think, thinking about what gives somebody power is kind of a question throughout the story. Like, is it money? Is it what you know about someone else? Is it what you're willing to do? And there's kind of these power struggle or power dynamics between all these different layers within the town. I love setting. I like to approach setting like it's a character in and of itself, and that this town has a backstory, just like any character has a backstory. And so I really try to embrace that and to explore it as much as I can. And I think you get a lot of tension from a place itself. One of the things I think about with any town is, and this is really something with any place, is that it can be the most wonderful place in the world and it can be the opposite. And I think so much of it comes from the character's perspective and the events that happen in a place. And so I love this idea that, there are these elements that are beautiful and they can also be terrifying, and kind of just playing with perspective is how to kind of just get even more from a setting.
Great insight. Now, you take readers into a much more anonymous by choice setting in The Girl from Widow Hills, where Olivia, aka Arden, is living off the grid with the media in pursuit, and where the folks from CaffeinatedReviewer.com discovered as they raced from page to page that when evidence seems to fall one way, Miranda twists and reveals to hold the reader captive. This really is one hell of a page turner, if I do say so. Was it hard to pull Olivia back into the unwanted spotlight in this story? And why was it necessary for her to reach ultimate redemption, so to speak?
That's the problem with thrillers, I think, is like you grow to love these characters and then you have to put them in these, terrible and terrifying situations, because that's what kind of creates their stories. So I find that I am someone who loves thinking about how the past influences the present. And it's a theme I come back to in so many of my books. And, this I feel like was just, such a literal version of that, where it's a character who became the center of this huge media story when they were growing up. And I started to think about, what about a character who doesn't want to be a part of that story? But this story suddenly feels like it belongs to everyone, not just her. And she's trying to kind of reclaim that and reclaim her own life. And so she changes her name and she believes she has a fresh start. And the book begins on the 20-year anniversary is approaching of this story. And she suddenly feels like she's being watched again. She thinks the press might have found her. And then the book kicks off that she begins sleepwalking, which she hasn't done since she was a child. And she kind of had an accident when she was sleepwalking. And she wakes up, this is not a spoiler, it's very early in the book, but she wakes up standing over a dead body in her front yard with no idea what happened. And so suddenly you have to I am fascinated with characters who they have to come to terms with these things that have happened to them. And I think so much of my process of writing characters is them coming face to face with not only what happened in the past, but the person they are and kind of the decisions they make. And so I usually see a character arc before I see the plot arc. But so much of the character arc is having to confront all these things that they have been terrified of. And maybe it's not just the plot terror, but for Olivia, it's the terror of people discovering who she truly was. And, the things that she has lost by keeping her past hidden has also, I think, prevented her from making these long-lasting relationships, because she doesn't want to ask questions of other people, so they don't ask questions of her.
When you're writing a story like the one set in such a quiet place, where you're taking a seemingly picture-perfect suburb like Hollow's Edge, which the Library Journal agreed was the perfect suburban setting, with 3 secretive, quirky neighbors and 3 unsolved murders. And what they rate was an Agatha Christie vibe that makes this whodunit an excellent beach read. Taking the whole domestic bliss ball and basically blowing it up must be one of the most thrilling parts of writing a mystery like this one.
We talked about how small towns are so fun to write and explore those dynamics. And I feel like I just kept pulling those boundaries tighter and tighter and tighter. And suddenly it was like, could I set an entire book within this neighborhood that looks like the perfect place to live and almost make this locked box mystery because everybody has a camera. And so, everyone is seeing what all of their who's coming in and out of this neighborhood, and it kind of creates this locked box. I think it's fascinating for, any of these characters, you have cameras, or they think they're doing them for their safety. So they have cameras, they have a neighborhood watch after there was a crime, and they believe these things are for their safety. And so much of kind of the things you dig into when you're writing like a thriller or something suspenseful is like, how can this also be used against you? And, what are the limitations to technology? You think that, you can see everything, but technology can be, adjusted. If the technology is there, it changes the way that people act too. So it kind of forces people to, not walk down the front of the street. Or feel like characters walk and they know exactly where the cameras are, and they're aware of it, and they're acting a certain way because you're kind of being caught somewhere. And it kind of went hand in hand with this whole neighborhood. Like there's the things you see on the surface, and then there's like the things that exist behind closed doors. So every household has, a different appreciation or not for this technology. And so it was kind of fun to play with like the one neighbor that doesn't have it, but has somebody watching. But, the eyewitness report wasn't, as strong as technology per se in a police investigation. So I think it was there was a certain house that was really interesting because it was several different generations. And so they each had kind of their different, teenagers have different understanding of technology than maybe the generation above in both how they use it or against it.
Publishers Weekly hailed one of your most recent bestsellers, Last To Vanish, as a superb thriller, and it's definitely the threshold you've gotten fans used to reading at, since you deliver it again and again, book in and out. With this latest novel set against the North Carolina mountain town of Cutter's Pass at the Passage Inn, and a journalist who shows up and then vanishes almost as quickly, I imagine it feels like a similarly paced process when you're in the rush of writing it.
Yeah, so The Last to Vanish is set in this small mountain resort town with a very mysterious history. Over the last 25 years, 7 visitors to the town have gone missing without a trace. Most recently, a journalist who was staying at the local inn, and he was investigating this string of unsolved disappearances. And the book is narrated by a woman named Abby, who was managing this local inn and suddenly finds herself at the center of a new investigation into the town's hidden secrets. And, she's somebody who kind of straddles the line again between insider and outsider, because she's lived in this town for 10 years, long enough for it to feel like home, but not quite long enough for the people who grew up generations and generations ago to feel like she is truly one of the members of this town. And so she can kind of see it from the inside, but also as an outsider, and kind of realizes all the things she didn't know about this place she calls home. I focus like one book at a time. And so I don't really start thinking about that next idea until I've turned in the book and had it off my plate for a little while. And the truth is that a lot of times writing the previous book will kind of inspire what I'm thinking about for the next book. There's certain things, like themes I keep coming back to, but a lot of times, I was writing about, For Such a Quiet Place, this really close-knit neighborhood that had this sort of tragic, recent history of several people who had died in the neighborhood, and also somebody who had been convicted of a murder. And so, the residents there were having difficulty with selling their homes, and it obviously had a reputation. And so I started to think about, like, what about a town that has this reputation, but what about a town that kind of leans into that reputation a little bit and embraces this mystery and kind of sees it as this tourist draw. And that's what really becomes exciting is you're exploring something new in every story. And I really enjoy that process of discovery early on. And so I guess that's the plus side of like not doing a lot of outlining for me, is that joy of jumping into a new mystery and exploring it and discovering it on my own. And of course, there are times later on where it becomes much more like time intensive, but that initial phase is just such an exciting, like anything can happen moment.
In that context, did anything from the writing of this most recent book maybe trigger an idea for a new one you might be working on now and could share a bit about with us?
No, I feel like it changes all the time. And sometimes I'll say I'm interested in a certain type of book, but like everything just keeps coming back to mysteries and suspense. When my kids are in high school now, but when they were younger, I loved this idea of like, I was reading so much middle grade fantasy with them. And I was like, oh, that's incredible. And I'm so impressed by like the world building involved in these, but I don't think that is my path. But in the back of my mind, I'm like, that would be absolutely incredible to create a world like that. I am working on a new book right now. And yes, I think it explores, there's another theme about the past and the present, but I can't talk about it too much just yet because I still, the books sometimes change a lot while I'm writing them.
Now, that's a smart way to play your cards, especially writing at the level you do now, where every book is expected to sell at or above the last one. That's just one example of how being a best-selling author isn't just the walk in the park it might sound like for as much fun as it is, and especially staying visible over the long term. It's definitely a tough business. Do you have any advice along those lines in closing for aspiring writers who are no doubt growing up reading your books right now, and maybe even finding their own voice writing fan fiction of your work?
It is a tough business. I think there are, especially in this business, there are always things that are outside of our control. And so for me, I've always tried to view success by the things that I can control. And for me, that is, the words on the page and the story itself. And, I'll sometimes have an idea in my head of what I hope a story becomes. And like my idea of success is like, I've gotten that draft to that point. And that's been something that's really helpful for me because, you can't necessarily control what the market is like at any given time or a reader's reaction. But I think if you write the book and you get it to the place that you intended it to be, like that is those quiet successes as well. And of course there are the external successes that are fantastic, but focusing on those has just been very helpful for me. And not to be afraid to sometimes make a change. I mean, I think it was a leap going from young adult to adult. I think I write them very similarly, and they're both things that I love. But sometimes like careers shift, and I've tried to kind of embrace that and see where it goes.
Megan Miranda, we've had a blast talking with you today. Thank you so much for taking out time to be on About the Authors TV.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This was a blast.